Tonight, Algeria bows its head in sorrow. The country is mourning the passing of former president and war veteran or mujahid Liamine Zeroual, a man widely remembered for his discipline, his reserve, and his sense of duty at one of the most difficult moments in modern Algerian history. According to the Presidency of the Republic, he passed away on Saturday evening after a long illness, and a 3-day national mourning period has been declared across the country and at Algerian diplomatic missions abroad. In this special edition, we look back at the man, the soldier, the president, and the legacy he left behind, from the years of crisis in the 1990s to the moral image he preserved long after leaving power. All this and more shortly.
تنظيم انتخابات رئاسية مسبقة.
المجد والخلود لشهدائنا الأبرار.
Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening, and welcome to tonight's special. To understand the weight of the moment and the man behind the office, we now turn to a portrait by Zahra Farjani, and then we come back for discussion.
At a time when Algeria was going through one of its most difficult periods, a name emerged quietly, yet left a lasting mark on the nation's history. Liamine Zeroual, a president who chose to serve in silence and step away just as quietly. Born in 1941 in the rugged Oures mountains of eastern Algeria, Zeroual developed a strong and resilient character early on. As a young man, he answered the call of independent struggle and rose through the ranks of the National People's Army, earning a reputation for discipline and professionalism while taking part in Algeria's fight for freedom. On January 31, 1994, Zeroual was appointed head of state and Minister of National Defense by the High Security Council. He was later elected President of Algeria on November 16, 1995. During his presidency, he worked to restore constitutional legitimacy, most notably through the 1996 constitutional referendum, which led to the creation of the upper house of parliament, the Council of the Nation. Zeroual also helped to rebuild state institutions through the legislative elections of June 1997 and the local elections later that October. In September 1998, Zeroual made the unexpected decision to shorten his term and called for early presidential elections, stepping down on April 27, 1999. After leaving office, he withdrew from political life, remaining a symbol of integrity, humility, and quiet leadership, a name that comes up whenever true responsibility and sincerity are remembered. Liamine Zeroual is not just a former president, but a chapter in Algeria's history written with wisdom, restraint, and dedication.
All right, let's bring in our guest to help us reflect on this national loss and the legacy it leaves behind. I am joined by three distinguished guests. Here in studio is Dr. Abdenour Toumi, journalist and media affairs expert. Dr. Abdenour, thank you for agreeing to be with us tonight.
Good evening, and thank you for having me on the program. And a special greeting to our dear friends and your distinguished guests, as always.
Thank you indeed. Joining us from Los Angeles is Dr. Hamoud Salhi, Associate Dean and Professor of International Studies at California State University, Dominguez Hills. Hello there, Professor, and thank you for agreeing to be with us tonight.
Always a pleasure, and my thanks and to including Sassy and Toomey on this program. It's always an honor and pleasure.
Well, you beat me to introducing Mohammed Chris Sassi, a financial expert and geopolitical analyst from New York. Thank you, Mohammed Chris Sassi, for agreeing to be with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and my pleasure to be my two dear friends, Dr. Toomey and Dr. Salhi. Thank you again for the invite.
Thank you indeed. So let's begin this debate with you, Dr. Abdenour Toomey. So when we come to look at the president or the passing president, the defunct Mr. Liamine Zeroual, what do we remember first? A president, a soldier, or a statesman who was shaped by restraint, let's say?
Actually, essentially, he was a virtuous man, and coming in a time where Algeria at that moment was going through very, very difficult time politically and also geopolitically as well, and economically. And he did, with his wisdom and his calmness, he succeeded to put a trajectory of, I will call it, modern politics. Having said that, at that moment where Algeria was in a moment of doubt, not because of the lack of man and its Algeria potential, but was a moment of question. But he stepped up at that moment, who shaped as I said, put the trajectory of politics by with his wisdom, and shaping a legacy that, let's say, 3 decades later. Unfortunately, not me, especially the young, don't know that period, but it has to be taught, that period, and written about it, and so on. So he did make that sense and launching the new, I would call it, modern or postmodern Algeria. And he made in his short term, and was like 4 years, it's short in politics, but he did 2-3 major things. First of all, he succeeded to install or establish constitutional reforms, and also he brought that sense to politics, the reconciliation. And that was very, very important element in politics of that time, that it's still going on and is still thriving up until today. And maybe you can speak this about this subject later. I saw this. There are now some European, African countries who are taking that model of reconciliation in politics, that bring all the different parties to live together and have that cohesion in politics, in which it's very rare in our time in politics. And this is what the main thing. Sure, there are other elements that are shaped his legacy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you indeed. And Dr. Hamoud Salhi, what is your view? What do you think made his public image among Algerians so distinct in Algerian political life?
I think your documentary, and Zahra narrates it very well. She talks about the man who is quiet, the man who comes at a chapter, it's one of the most difficult chapters of Algeria, and then a man of integrity. And I think him focusing on what is the most important during a critical time, as Dr. Toomey pointed out, of the nation, and do it discreetly, fits very well, was something that saved Algeria. let's not forget, Algeria was internally fragmented. This is the decade, as Dr. Toumi mentioned, of the dark decades, or the darkest decade in Algeria. So you have the state in very, very difficult situation. And then remember also, Algeria was in severe debts. There were restrictions by the IMF. There was deep problems that Algeria had to face. Algeria was going to be as a failed state, but the former president, Zeroual, was able to keep it united, and more than anything else, away from any international interference. And that saved Algeria. As a man, just small things. He joined the Algerian revolutionary movement at the age of 15, went on and became leader of the revolutionary movement. And when he got to the presidency, he was the symbol of the Algerian revolution, and under which the legitimacy of Algeria at the time, or the legitimacy of leadership, was taken from the revolution. And then you could add a couple other things, and these are really small point in the history. He was a person who understood that our neighbors, or our neighbor particularly on the west side, was seizing the opportunity to intervene in the country and took the right decision of close the border and cut the relationship with that country. And also, he's the man who would find a resource to finance Algeria, to build some financial sustainability for the country by opening the Gazoud, the Mediterranean European gas line pipeline, and that makes Algeria very relevant. So there are so many things what makes him popular. And then if you could just see, those Algerians know where he lives. Batna, the place where his house is a modest place. His sons, for example, are very much sort of part of the people, and he kept that, and he led, as the committee pointed out, Algeria with integrity, quiet, and during a difficult time.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Mr. Mohamed Krisasi? Why does his figure still inspire respect across different generations and political sensitivities?
Well, following what just Professor Salhi said, as well as Dr. Toumi, Liamine Zeroual was the general who saved the Algerian nation, and it captures the real perception. But we need the context to understand what he did and why his reputation still endures. The situation he inherited was near state collapse. When Zeroual took power in 1994, Algeria was deep in the Algerian civil war. Armed groups like the Armed Islamic group were carrying out mass killing. The state had lost in part of the country. Political legitimacy was shattered after the cancellation of the election of 1992. Yes, Algeria was not just unstable, it was a risk of prolonged fragmentation or total breakdown. Why? This is why Zeroual stood out in figure of the situation. Like some, I'm sorry, I'm so emotional when I talk about that, but like some figures of the era, Zeroual, the general, has a distinct profile. As my predecessor said, Mr. Salhi, Dr. Salhi, as well as Dr. Toumi, he was a military officer, but he was seen also as a simple person, and he had a personality a little bit austere, but it was always very clean image, not deeply tied to factional power struggle within the regime at that time. He was viewed by many Algerians as a almost reluctant ruler rather than an ambitious politician. That gave him something rare, very rare at that time, a degree of public credibility. And he did restore the state control. The Algerian army intensified operation, intelligence network was improved, the armored group were gradually weakened. I talk about the terrorist group, and the period marked a turning point. The insurgency shifted from expansion to defense survival, and in some sense, he helped reverse the trajectory of the war. He did rebuilding political legitimacy. Zeroual did
Excuse me, Mr. Mohammed Chris Sassi, the sound is not very clear, so we're going to get back to you again, perhaps with a phone call.
Okay.
Meanwhile, I ask you, Dr. Abdenour Toumi, you mentioned his political life earlier, and you mentioned one of his main traits, especially when it comes to the legacy, which is national reconciliation. Now, how do you think did he try to balance security imperatives with the political opening that Algeria started to witness at that time?
It's a good question, because now in the person and his background, coming from a military background, and we know the military have that virtuous characteristic of discipline and order. So this is what his main imperative to work on, because so at that moment Algeria was, I won't say was unstable or going or heading toward chaos, because the institutions were solid, and but it was a moment of doubt, and that in which Algeria didn't go through that since its independence. It was like actually time frame was about decades of independence. That was that intermediary time of transgeneration. That he came at that moment was, it is historic for Algeria as a modern state. So he succeeded to shape that path and working on national reconciliation and bringing these civil concordance all together, and bring from the political spectrum, it was very, very hard to bring all the political actors who were on the field at that moment and to lead to this reconciliation in order to avoid the chaos. So that was his actually military background, and he was like a real soldier. At that moment, Algeria needed someone like him, but he was doing that with wisdom, calm, and strategy ahead. So because he did, just in his short term, 4 year and 1 term, so he did succeed and handed over to his successor to continue, and his successor was late President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who had also that political wisdom and persona as well. So he made he paved the way for him, that he continued to take Algeria to a safe place, in which 30 years later, or now like 25 later, Algeria now is in good shape. Having said that, there were some, at that moment, like it was mentioned by Professor Sarhi and Mr. Sassi, about the economic challenges, because Algeria was at that time almost cornered by the international community and the almost sanctions of the IMF and so on. But he did succeed on that, and he did also, when it comes to national security, it was an imperative for the country. He did manage that locally and sub-regionally. For instance, like it was mentioned, one was at that moment, the neighboring country in the West was trying to create some of destabilization, but it didn't work because, as I said, the institution of the state at that moment were solid. So he did succeed on that thorny issue and brought all the country together, and he put that trajectory from the societal perspective, the economically and socially, to the political and institutionals. That's why the institutions kept intact. And to some extent, he did, as I stated earlier, he did lead to constitutional reforms.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Hamoud Salhi, when it comes to his role in steering Algeria through one of its most difficult periods in the 1990s, how would you assess it?
Very constructive, with the main goal of preserving the Algerian unity. And what's very interesting is how that approach was translated into his efforts and the efforts of the state to bring the country to a place of quietness, peaceful. And one could make a strong case is that how he approached the issue of terrorism. And what he did is that he put terrorism as a legal matter. Terrorism, as we know, tend to be associated, particularly for the Western side, with a political agenda. So during his time, he conceptualized, or the law was very clear about who is the terrorist, and that terrorist is treated as a crime against three things: the morals, the fabrics of Algerian society, the state institution, the public institution, and then the last one, any crimes. Those are not in order, but against people and their properties. And that what sets the stage is separated, is lay the foundation of establishing a legal institution, such as the court, to address those issues specifically. And later on, in the same pattern, we have Qanun al-Rahma that came there to find solutions, practical, positive solutions to end this dark age. And again, there you had efforts at calling for those who want to save the country, to put arms aside and seize the opportunity to help the country heal. Mm-hmm. And then finally, and there are so many other things, is how he approached the issue of governing. We moved on during his time from him being head of state to a republic. And then what he did more than anything else is putting a limit on the terms of the presidency, only to leave earlier than when he was expected for his mandate to end. So there are the context that Toumi talks about and Sassi is very, very, very important. And to a large degree, he was actually the man that Algeria needed at the time, a quiet man, a capable, a discreet person, and more than anything else, a man with a vision that support Algerian national unity and put it above anything else.
Thank you indeed. And a final question to you, Mr. Mohammed Kourisasi. How significant was his decision to leave power voluntarily in 1999?
Well, that's part of the personality of the President Zeroual, but also of the General Zeroual. He was not attached to any party. He was a man issued from the most humble society of Algeria. He was a fighter. And he did find that as a soldier, he finished his duty. He saved the nation from collapsing. He put in place some institution, republic institution, that they were in danger, before he come to power. And as a general, as the father of the country, he said, it's time for me to finish. Mission accomplished. And I think this is why, up to today's date, we have his reputation that endures up to the moment what I am talking about you, because of the situation is inherited, because of the fragmentation of the Algerian nation at that time. He come there like the savior of the nation. And I think he did it, and his successor was trying to follow his path. But as I said, he was a man, he was an Algerian, he was a general, and it was above all very, very, very honest and integer. And when he finished his mission, he just walk away from politics, he get back to Batna, and he was living just as a simple citizen, how can I say that I'm so emotional? Because I saw him once in Batna. It was like the common Algerian, nothing on his shoulder, saying hello to one of the few politicians that can walk in the street and everybody want to talk, to touch and have his benediction.
Thank you indeed. Thank you indeed, Mr. Mohammed
his
Kristasi.
heritage.
We have reached the end of this special edition for tonight. I thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed Kristasi. Same thanks goes to
You're
you,
welcome.
Dr. Abdunnoor Toumi, here with me in studio, and Dr. Hamoud Salhi. Thank you indeed for your time. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, we reach the end of this special coverage. And as you heard, tonight Algeria remembers Liamine Zeroual not only as a former head of state, but as a man of duty who carried responsibility in a difficult age. His death has opened a moment of national reflection on service, restraint, sovereignty, and the burden of leadership. The official mourning period, the final tribute, and the planned burial in Batna province all underscore the place he holds in the country's collective memory. And with this, I can only say, may God have mercy on the late President Liamine Zeroual, and may he grant his family and the Algerian people, the entire Algerian people, patience and solace. To God we belong, and to him we shall return.